heard that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said unto him, because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked riches for thyself, nor asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment, behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither shall there be any arise like unto thee. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And if thou wilt walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as thy father David did walk, and then I will lengthen thy days. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and he offered up burnt offerings and offered peace offerings, and he made a feast to all his servants. And then it says, there came two women that were harlots unto the king, and stood before him. And the one woman said, O my Lord, I and this woman dwell in one house, and I was delivered of a child with her in the house. And it came to pass the third day after that I was delivered, that this woman was delivered also. And we were together, and there was no stranger with us in the house, save we two in the house. And this woman's child died in the night, because she overlaid it. And she arose at midnight, and took my son from beside me while the handmaid slept, and laid it in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I arose in the morning to give my child suck, behold, it was dead. But when I had considered it in the morning, behold, it was not my son which I did bear. And the other woman said, Nay, but the living is my son, and the dead is thy son. And this said, No, but the dead is thy son, and the living is my son. And thus they spake before the king. And then they said the king, The one saith, This is my son that liveth, and thy son is the dead. And the other saith, Nay, but the son is the dead, and my son is the living. And the king said, Bring me a sword. And they brought the sword, a sword before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. And then spake the woman whose the living child was unto the king, for her bowels yearned upon her son. And she said, O my lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. But the other said, Let it be neither mine nor thine, but divide it. And then the king answered, and he said, Give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. She is the mother thereof. And all Israel heard this judgment, which the king has judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. And so in the first couple chapters, we've been answering some questions. Chapter 1, as we said, answered the question, who would be king after David? And so then chapter 2 kind of showed us how that kingdom would be secure, and how would Solomon go about doing that. So those questions have been answered for us, and so now Solomon's rule has been firmly established. Nobody is doubting who the king should be. As we saw in the last chapter, threats have been eliminated. As far as we can tell, at least in scriptures, as far as scripture is concerned, there is no genuine threat to Solomon's reign. And so now Solomon begins to solidify his kingdom. And so the first thing he does is he reaches out to the king of Egypt in order to marry his daughter. Now, I'm going to come back to this thought in a minute. There's a lot of questions, a lot of debates about this, but I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Now, we certainly can't determine all of Solomon's intentions in this. I mean, really, all we get in the text is it says, Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David. Nowhere behind that is, here's why Solomon did this. His heart yearned for her. He saw her. She was beautiful. Or this was a political thing. We're not given any of this. So the assumption then is if Solomon is reaching out to a very strategic king in a very strategic part of the world to marry his daughter, that this was a political thing. And so this would strengthen political ties between Israel and Egypt. Obviously, Egypt is just to the south of Israel. If anybody was to come up from Africa to come to Israel, they'd have to go through Egypt to do it. And so it was an important area for them to kind of have strengthened and have good, strong ties with. Also, furthermore, just as a historical note, it was a long-standing tradition, whatever word you want to use, that the Egyptians did not marry their daughters off to foreign people. They did not do it. They would allow their sons to marry foreign daughters for political reasons, but they would not marry off their daughters to foreign sons. It was not something that was done. They viewed it as weakness. However, at this particular point in time, just again on a historical note, as Solomon begins to reign, Egypt was historically pretty weak at this particular point. And so this was seen as one of the first ever, if not the only time ever, that Egypt actually allowed this to take place, for one of the Pharaoh's daughters to marry a foreign king. And so, again, all of that just to say that this was whereas there might have been other intentions. This was a mainly politically strategic move for Solomon. This is why he does this. We don't know if this is his first wife. Obviously, we know that Solomon follows in the steps of his father when it comes to problems with women. He's going to end up having hundreds of wives, and on top of that, even hundreds more concubines. And so Solomon has a tremendous issue when it comes to this particular area. Like I said, for all we know, this is wife 5. We don't know. But this was probably political in nature. Constable, he said, the fact that Solomon could marry such a person as an Egyptian princess shows the social and political height to which God elevated him. A descendant of former Egyptian slaves now becomes Pharaoh's son-in-law. Right? So this is an impressive thing. And as I mentioned a while ago, Egypt didn't do this, but they were weak at this point. And so for Egypt, what would strengthen them the best is for their daughter to marry the Israelite king. Right? I mean, he could have married her to other kings. He chose to allow her to marry the Israelite king. And so it shows the strength of Israel at this particular time. And as I've already been saying, Israel was never stronger than under David. Obviously, this is at the very beginning of Solomon's reign. And so he's riding upon the foundation of his father's kingdom. And actually, he'll kind of mention that here in just a second. And so Israel at this point is very, very strong. And so the Egyptian Pharaoh saw this as a strong alliance. Now, Solomon was concerned not only with the political strength of Israel, but its internal strength. And so during Solomon's reign, the walls of Jerusalem were made much higher. It says in verse 1 that he brought her into the city of David until he had made an end of building his house, building his own house, and the house of the Lord, and the wall of Jerusalem round about. Now, at this particular point, Jerusalem already had walls, but Solomon really made them higher, stronger, better, more defensible, those kinds of things. And so he was concerned with the strength of Israel. Obviously, he was building palaces. We know that he builds his house. He's going to build the temple. All of these things we're going to see over the next several chapters. Furthermore, high places. This is an emphasis at the beginning of this chapter. High places were being used around the nation. And it specifically says, because there was no house built under the name of the Lord. Now, it is likely that at this time that the tabernacle was still erected somewhere, but it would not be anywhere near, I guess you could say, the glory that it had, particularly during the wilderness when it was first made, but over the centuries that have taken place since then. And so people begin to have these high places. Now, I'll get into it now. And so there's an obvious question here. So, all of these things could be seen either positively or negatively. All of these things could be seen. Well, Solomon is trying to strengthen Israel. People have a plethora of places where they can go and sacrifice and worship. These things can be seen positively. They can also be seen incredibly negatively. Obviously, there was in Deuteronomy and I think Exodus as well, there is the prohibition against marrying foreign women. Obviously, the high places, already by this point in time, were known places of idolatry, and later on in Israel's history, this will become an increasing prevalent problem. High places were used all the time, not by any means to worship God, but for the purposes of idolatry and the worshiping of false gods. And so, again, the question is, how do we take this? Because the author doesn't really present it positively or negatively. Here's what happened. He just tells us. And so I will say this. I think verse 3 tells us how we are to take this. So verse 3, it says, and Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. And so there's a reason why the author, the biblical author, gives us this particular phrase. After telling us these things that Solomon was doing, and then he says, and Solomon loved God. He loved God. He walked in the ways of God, as did David. And so to me, it seems as if the biblical author is wanting us to take this positively and not negatively. And so let me explain a few things. Solomon married a foreign woman. However, the prohibition of foreign marriage was to combat idolatry. When you go and you read Exodus and Deuteronomy, when Moses is telling them, God says don't marry, first of all, the list of nations that he gives were all Canaanites. He says, don't marry Canaanite women. And secondly, he gives the reason, don't marry Canaanite women for the purposes of they're going to draw your heart away from God. Now, that does eventually happen with Solomon. He's probably the prime example of that happening in Scripture. And so the reason he gave the command was for the purposes of worship. They're going to draw your heart away from God. You're going to worship false gods. And so this woman was not a Canaanite, and it seems, at least at this particular point in time, she was not drawing Solomon's heart away. Whether or not she is one of the ones who does it later on, we're not told. But again, I don't think what Solomon does here is violating that particular law. And then the high places. The high places did eventually become houses of idol worship. Again, we know that. But there is nothing in the text here that would indicate that they were being used for false worship. And so, in fact, it says in verse 2, only people sacrificed in high places. Why? Why were they doing that? It says because there was no house built under the name of the Lord. So the built-in assumption then is that because there was no place to do this for the Lord, they were doing that in the high places. In other words, sacrificing unto God, not sacrificing unto false gods, not worshiping idols. And so, again, all of this, I believe, in my opinion, all of this is being told to us to show that Solomon is doing, I guess you could say, everything he could at this particular point in time to worship God as he felt proper and to help strengthen Israel, both politically, militarily, but also spiritually. And then also, with regards to the high places, we read it just a second ago, it is at one of these high places, after Solomon had worshipped there, that God meets with Solomon. And so, and by the way, never once tell Solomon, you shouldn't be here and you shouldn't be doing this. And so all of this, again, I don't think we need to take the beginning of this in a negative light. Some do, but I would disagree. I think the author is presenting it to us as positive actions of Solomon. And so here we are in Gibeon. And so Solomon goes to one of these high places. It says, verse 4, and the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. And so it seems like Gibeon was kind of the prime central location as far as high places were concerned. And so he goes there, the great high place, and then 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer upon that altar. And so Solomon was never one to do half measures. Solomon, if Solomon was going to do something, he goes all out, and he does it. He doesn't give just a couple of burnt offerings. He gives 1,000 burnt offerings. He doesn't just marry one woman. He marries 300 women, right? I mean, Solomon does everything. He goes out on everything he does. Sometimes that was good. Sometimes that was very, very bad. But here he goes to Gibeon, and he offers 1,000 burnt offerings. And then verse 5 is where this very important moment in Solomon's reign and life happens. And so in verse 5, it says, in Gibeon, at the high place is where he is, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and he said, ask what I shall give thee. And so, whereas it's likely not the only reason, I don't want to give that impression. I don't believe it's the only reason that God appears to Solomon. It should not be lost on us that God responded to the worship of Solomon. I don't think that the only reason God appeared is because Solomon gave those 1,000 burnt offerings. But should not be lost on us that he does, in fact, respond to the worship of Solomon. So it was after Solomon offers 1,000 of these offerings that God does come and appear to him. And then he asks him, what do you want? And he lavishly blesses Solomon with not just what he asks, but for that which he didn't even ask. We'll see that here in just a second. And then I would add to that, furthermore, the same God who lavishly gifts Solomon is the same gift-giving God that we still serve today. And we read in James chapter 1, which I would suggest that James was likely thinking about and being influenced by this particular passage when he writes this. But in James 1:5, it says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Right? So there's obvious similarities there between what James says and what our story has with Solomon. And in other words, to say, I'm not saying God's going to appear to you tonight in a vision and he's going to give you whatever you ask for. But I am saying that God is still blessing. God is still a gift-giving God. And those are almost more often than not, well, I would say more often than not, spiritual in nature, not physical in nature. But that's not to say that he's not still lavishly gifting his people. And those that love him, those that worship him, those that respond to him. And so in answer to God's question then, Solomon begins to reminisce. He begins to think about the goodness of God in the past. And this is always a good thing for us to do. One thing I like to point out is that the Bible is consistently calling us to remember, all right? Calling us to go back, calling us to recall the goodness of God in our lives. And this is a very strong a recourse for Christians. If we're going through some difficulty or some kind of trial, something in our lives that's hard, one of the best things that we can do is to go back and think about the former times that we've been through and how God led us through those. And if God led us through those, well, it just makes sense. He's going to lead us through these too. And so the Israelites were constantly, just go through the Old Testament, just at the back of your mind, just keep a track of every time this is brought up. Remember the wilderness. I'm the God who brought you out. I led you out of Egypt. You were in slavery, and I led you out. They're constantly being called to go back and to remember this. And so Solomon does this. He remembers. He thinks about what God has done. And that's verse 6. He said, Thou hast showed unto thy servant David my father great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and uprightness of heart. It says, Thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne. And so he says, I remember the covenant that you made with David. Obviously, David would have told Solomon about this. He says, I know that you made this covenant with David. I know that you've been faithful to keep it. And so he begins to think about the goodness of God. And so God had greatly rewarded the righteousness of David. We see that in verse 6. And he kept his promise by making his son king. Right? And so we know that's not a guaranteed thing. David, more than anybody, knows that's not a guaranteed thing because he's not the son of Saul. And yet here he was king when the covenant was made. And so they know that this isn't a guaranteed thing. And so God had kept his promise to David by making his son king. And then in verse 7, Solomon says, not only did you bless David by doing that, but you blessed me because I am that son. I'm the one you made king. And so you've blessed my father, you've blessed me. And so he begins to think about the implications of this. You've blessed David by making a son of his king. You've blessed me by making me that son who is king. But because I'm king, now there's a great task ahead of me. Because I'm the king of your people, I know that I have a very important job. And so this is where he starts to think about what's before him. And so at the end of verse 7, he says, I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in. We don't know how old Solomon was at this particular point. We have no idea as far as, the maturity level and those kind of things. But Solomon here is saying, I'm a young person, I'm a young man. And that phrase there, I don't know how to go out or come in, that's going out and coming in is a phrase that's used a handful of times in the Bible. And it's kind of in reference to wisdom, okay? And so that's typically how it's used. And so Solomon's saying, I know that this is, for me to do this job well and to do it as best as I can, is going to require a great deal of wisdom. And so I want to do this well because I understand who it is I'm ruling. I'm not ruling just any people. This isn't just any nation. These are the people of God. These are your children. And so I want to do this well. And so he says, give therefore thy servant an understanding heart. This is probably the best thing Solomon could have asked for. Maybe some argument could be made for something else, some kind of, give me a righteous life or something along those lines. But given the task at hand, this is one of the best things he could have asked for. And his answer pleases God. And so we see there in verse 10, it says, and the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked for this thing. And so God responds positively to Solomon's request, and he tells him, I have done according to thy words. Why? Because Solomon could have asked for anything. God didn't put any parameters on this. He just says, what do you want, right? At the end of verse 5, ask what I shall give thee. That's all he says, right? And so Solomon could have asked for anything. And God tells him that. You could have asked for a long life. You could have asked for money. You could have asked for the death of your enemies, right? You could have made it so that your reign was just as simple as it could be. But that's not what you asked for. And so God grants him his request. And then beyond that, he gives him what he didn't ask for. And so God would make Solomon wise beyond anybody who came before you, anybody who would come after you. And I believe that. I believe that Solomon is the wisest man who has ever or will ever live outside of Christ, right? And so I don't believe anybody will ever even touch the wisdom of Solomon. And you go through and you read the book of Proverbs and things like that, and you can see how tremendously wise this man was. And then furthermore, like I said, God would give him what he didn't ask. He would give him riches. He would give him long life. He would give him these things. So he'd be richer than any king. He would provide, and provided Solomon would keep the commandments, he says, I will lengthen your days. And so Solomon then, he wakes up. Remember, this vision is coming to him as he's asleep. He wakes up, and it tells us that he goes to the ark in Jerusalem. And so, again, what is the ark? The ark is the representation of the presence of God. And that's important for our understanding. The ark wasn't the only place God resided. Obviously, we understand that. He's omnipresent. But the ark was the, you could say, the physical representation of God's presence. And so that's where Solomon goes. He goes to be before the ark, and there he gives more offerings. And then in appreciation of God, he throws a feast. He throws a feast for his servants. He's worshiping, and he's praising, and he's lavishly gifting others. And so he's doing for others in a small degree what God had done for him. And so what I want to say about that before moving on is that Solomon's actions and his prayer show us that the true purpose of worship is to please God. When we gather together as God's people corporately to worship, a lot of people have a lot of ideas about what worship is and what worship looks like. Well, fundamentally, the Bible tells us that worship is for the purpose of pleasing God. Now, why that matters is because so many today want to make worship about pleasing the worshiper, right? People devise plans and services, and they design even the buildings and the way the lighting works. They do everything in order to please the worshiper, right? We want you, the worshiper, we want you to have an experience. We want you to really feel like you've been in God's presence. But the Bible shows us over and over that worship is not about us. Worship is about the God we're worshiping. And so the things that we are doing shouldn't be, the thing we shouldn't think about is this making people happy? Is this making, and in particular what they're asking, is this making unbelievers comfortable? That's typically what they're asking. Is this making people happy? Is this making unbelievers comfortable? Is it going to make this guy who's never been here, is this going to make him want to come back? That doesn't need to be our focus. Our focus needs to be, is this pleasing to God? Are we worshiping in the right way? And over and over and over, the Bible tells us not only is worship about God, but God cares about the way we worship. And we have these, what should be terrifying stories in the Old Testament in particular, but also in the New. But we have these stories that should leave us shaking to even contemplate the fact that I'm going to take worship, and instead of make it about God, I'm going to make it about the people. Right? And so we have, Aaron's sons being killed. Why? Because they worshiped improperly. They burned a fire in a wrong way. You have Uzzah who touches the ark, and God instantly kills him. Why? Because he cares about the way in which he's worshipped. And fundamentally, what does that look like? And I don't think there's just one singular way in which that happens. But what it has to do is it has to make God the focus, and it has to be about God. And so God, as I said a while ago, God responded. Why? Because Solomon goes and he offers 1,000 burnt offerings. To who? To God. This is just Solomon and God. Solomon isn't asking everybody, hey, what do you think is the best way to make the sacrifice? Would it make you more comfortable if I broke the animal's neck instead of let it bleed out in front of you? Right? He didn't ask them what makes you comfortable. He just goes and he does what God told him to do. And so he prays, and God blesses him, and then what does he do? He gives more offerings. That's what he does. He continues to worship God. And so this is something that the Bible consistently calls us to think about, and we should think about this. And so the chapter then closes with Solomon's wisdom put to the test, you could say. And so God grants him this wisdom. Now, we don't know how, if this happened immediately. We don't know if Solomon comes back to Jerusalem and this is the next day. We don't know exactly at what point in his rule or his reign this particular story takes place. In fact, I saw some who questioned the validity of the story at all, whether this was almost like a parable. I won't even get into that. I believe this is a real story. I believe it really happened. And I would say it happens early. That's what I would say, is that it happens early. Whether or not this is, right after these events or not, I don't think we can say definitively, but I would say very, very early. And so verse 16, these two women who are harlots, and it specifically tells us this, and I'll come to that. These two women who are harlots, they come to the king, and they tell him this really terrible story. And so these women come to Solomon with a unique complaint. I'll quote DeVry here. He said that the fact that the two mothers were prostitutes is important in the story because it shows how the wise king would act on behalf of the very lowest of his subjects. And honestly, this was not even something, I've thought about this story before, but this is not something that I ever really even thought about. The fact that these two prostitutes are given essentially free reign to go before the king. I mean, think about that. Solomon is king of the whole nation. And so somebody might think, surely he had a counselor whispering in his ear, Solomon, you have much more important things to be dealing with than these two women. We have treasury things to deal with. We've got battles we need to be talking about. There's land to be taking over. But for whatever reason, Solomon saw it as important. No, these women are here to talk to the king, and therefore I'm going to talk to them. And as far as we can see, from everything we get in Scripture, it seems as if Solomon, it didn't matter who they were, it didn't matter their occupation, it didn't matter their status, if they wanted, as a citizen of the kingdom, if they wanted to come before the king, they had access. And this is important for us as Christians because we also are citizens of a kingdom, and it doesn't matter our status, we have access to the king. Now, obviously, I'm not condoning what they do. I'm not condoning their lifestyle. It was sinful. It was wicked. It was awful. They shouldn't have been a part of it. But our sin, let me say this, our sin can prohibit our prayers from reaching God. But God will always listen to the repentant child reaching out and seeking out God's grace, forgiveness, and mercy. God will listen to that prayer. And so there's an interesting, New Testament parallel here. And so these women come. To make a long story short, they both were pregnant. They both show up at this. We don't know exactly where they were living. There's all kinds of questions that could be raised with that. One of the women has a baby. 3 days later, the other one has a baby. And during the night, it says that one of them overlaid it. And it specifically tells us nobody else was there. It was just these two women, so we can't blame anybody else. That she overlaid it, meaning more than likely what happened is she was probably, breastfeeding the child, falls asleep, and smothers it. That's more likely, it's the most likely option here. This was probably, sadly enough, probably not uncommon. Things like this still happen today. And so the woman wakes up, sees her child is dead, sneaks to the other woman, takes her child from her living child, gives her the dead one. And obviously this is terrible. This is heart-wrenching, and to think that somebody would do this. But also you have to understand these women are not living righteously. Obviously, they're not what you would call in any kind of close relationship with God. Furthermore, she's dealing with undeniable grief, and she's probably very, very angry with herself. Needless to say, I don't think she's really thinking through all the moral implications of what she's doing. And so she goes and she switches babies. Well, the other woman wakes up in the middle of the night, can't exactly tell what's going on yet, but when it's daylight out and she can actually see, she looks down and she can see, this is not my child. Yes, newborns, they do, there are a lot of similarities. A lot of newborns do look alike, but a mother knows the face of her baby. So she looks down and she sees, this is not my child. And so they come to Solomon to figure this out. Obviously, both of them are saying, no, my child is the living one. And so Solomon, he kind of summarizes, what they said. He wants to make sure he gets the story right. And then he says, bring me a sword. This is one of those events where you truly would like to be one of the people who are witnessing this. Because just going off of what the Scripture tells us, Solomon doesn't tell anybody what he's about to do. He doesn't tell his servants what he's about to do, his counselors what he's about to do. He doesn't tell these women what he's about to do. He says just, bring me a sword. And so the true mother is standing there absolutely horrified. Why does he want the sword? What in the world is going on? And so stark curiosity then turns to horror for that particular mother, as he says, divide the living child in two, give half to the one and half to the other. Both women should have been horrified, but only one was. And so the false mother, like I said a while ago, this is one of the reasons why people kind of question this. You know, why would she be okay with this? She's dealing with a lot. She's dealing with a lot, and she gets to this kind of mental state where essentially she says, if my child is dead, hers needs to be dead too. That's kind of where she gets to. And it sounds almost unbelievable, but I mean, like I said, even today, there are stories of, they call it postpartum depression and things like this. There are stories of mothers doing just amazingly horrific things to their children. And you ask, how could a mother ever do something like that? And so this story is 100% believable. I have no problem at all believing that she would have done this, dealing with the grief and everything, and just now she's petty, right? Now she's being selfish and say, if I can't have a child, you can't either. And so she's fine with it. And then obviously the true mother, she just cries out, no, let her have it. Let her have the boy. And so for the true mother, she would rather give him up than have him killed. Well, Solomon never intended to harm the child whatsoever. This was never something that he was actually going to do. And so he knew one of them was lying. He just didn't know which one. And so he just needed to reveal the liar. And so obviously this particular test revealed it quite clearly. So now that he knows, he gives the boy to the rightful mother. And then the chapter ends by this. All Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. And that's an interesting way to close. It's not just that they saw, oh, he's wise, but in particular, he's wise to do judgment. In other words, we better make sure we're doing things right. We better make sure we're following the law. We better make sure that things are on the up and up. Now, sadly for Israel, and what ultimately kind of starts a decline that takes place over the course of several years, is that Solomon kind of loses that. Solomon gets to the point where he's not following the law. Solomon is drawn away from God and starts living unrighteously. And as the king goes, so goes the nation. And so this is, when we get there, we'll see that that's the start of the downfall of Israel. And that's why I've been saying they were never better than when they were under David. And so I'll close with this quote. He says, the wisdom, discernment, and justice of Solomon point to one who will outstrip Solomon, to one in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And if such a king already has begun to reign, must we not assume, as his subjects, that he will never ordain or order anything in our circumstances except what is in line with wisdom at its highest and best? And why I like that quote is because of what he didn't say. I like that quote because what he didn't say is, must we assume that he will always ordain that which makes us happy? He will always ordain that which makes us comfortable. That's not what he says, because that's not what the scriptures say. No, he will always ordain that which is best according to his knowledge. And so this is something, people, they ask questions all the time, why me? God, why would you allow this to happen to me? And so on and so forth. And oftentimes, I'd be willing to venture every time somebody asks this, they have failed either to understand or to remember that God's ways are higher than our ways. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. God has an infinite, omniscient understanding and a sovereign rule over this world that you and I could never even begin to comprehend. And so sometimes, yes, God does allow or even ordain difficult things to happen in our life. But there's always a purpose behind it. There's always a reason behind it. He's not a purposeless ruler. He doesn't just throw out difficulties and trouble just to get a chuckle out of it. No, there's a reason behind the things that we endure in this world. And so that's why I liked that quote, because of what he doesn't say. And we have to think about that. The difficulties that we face in this life and the trials and things of that nature, we have to understand there's a great high priest who is infinitely wise, who is ruling over all this, who is sovereign over all this. And as a child of that high priest who is infinitely wise and sovereign, that ought to be a comfort to us. It ought to be a comfort to us. And so we ought to be just like the citizens of Israel at that particular point and understand, oh, our king is infinitely wise to do judgment. Our king has all the understanding, and that ought to create in us a zeal to live righteously. Okay, so we have a